Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today, I'm going to start by going back 20 years ago, 2004. At that time, my very first book, Faces of the Civil War, an album of Union soldiers and their stories, was published by Johns Hopkins University Press. Hard to believe it's been 2 decades. When I was done, my editor, Bob Brugger, great editor, asked me a question that I was wholly unprepared for. What are you going to do next? Honestly, I had never thought about it, never given it a thought. I was so excited to have one book done, and that book took me 4 years to write and get published. I didn't even have it in my mind to do another one. But as I thought about Bob's question, it occurred to me that a series of books that viewed the Civil War through the lens of distinct groups of individuals who shared common experiences during these most uncommon times could work, and it would be distinctly unique. For example, White Union Soldiers, that's my first book. My next book, Confederate Soldiers, and then Navy men, women nurses and other caregivers, and Black soldiers in the U.S. colored troops. All these books, all 5 of them, were my effort at telling these broader narratives of the war through the very human lens. Well, today I was reminded of another much smaller group that could be a 6th book. Of course, there's a bunch of other books that could happen. But this one struck me, and it's related to the man pictured here. His name is Edwin M. Maine, the 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry. And he was one of those white officers that was part of the USCT. In fact, he was in the role of major for 3 years, from 1863 to 1866, which makes him another unusual group of soldiers who served for 5 years. He started out first in 1861, 5 years as a volunteer in the Army. Anyway, his coverage of his first time in the colored troops, joining in 1863, was the very formation of African American Civil War troops. He writes in his regimental history of the 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry with pride of the accomplishments of the Black soldiers in blue and the white officers who stepped forward to command them. And he did this at a time, as he points out, when the white population of the North was highly skeptical that men of color could fight. His perspective, I think, is useful. In that regimental history, in the introduction, he shares an address that he made at what appears to be the first reunion of the white officers of the regiment. And he uses it, as I mentioned, in the introduction of the book, kind of a preface to the book. So let me read this to you because I think it's an interesting perspective to consider. Again, remember, this is an address. And he says, "Mr. President and comrades," he's talking to the reunion group. He says that the colored troops acquitted themselves with credit has been fully demonstrated, and that the success they achieved was due to the patriotism and unflinching bravery of their white officers must also be admitted. It is needless to say that without efficient white officers, the experiment with Negro troops would have been a total failure. The officers of Negro troops have not received the credit to which they are so deservedly entitled, and for which the great service they rendered to the country in its darkest hour of peril demands, rising above the storm of prejudice then prevailing against the Negro troops. They came to the rescue at a time when the Union was tottering on the brink of dissolution. Voluntary enlistments had ceased in the loyal states, and the Union Army was wasting away before the invincible legions of Lee and Johnston. Scattered as it was over a vast territory, the Union Army was unable to face their opponents and, at the same time, hold the already subjugated territory. At this period of the war, the fact first dawned on the Northern mind that one of the greatest elements of strength the South possessed consisted in her slave population, numbering 4 million souls, who tilled the soil, produced the sugar, rice, cotton, and corn that fed and clothed the Confederate armies, and who also looked after the home interests, while the entire white male population flocked to the supports of the Southern standard. But the usefulness of the Negroes did not end here. In the capacity of pioneers and teamsters, in fact, performing all the various duties pertaining to an army, they formed a valuable auxiliary to the Southern cause. Then the Negroes were made the instruments for the destruction of the Union and for perpetuating their own enslavement. It became apparent, therefore, that to save the Union, slavery must be destroyed. The people of the North failed to comprehend the true condition of affairs until they saw their own farms and workshops deserted in consequence of the heavy drafts made for men to fill up the depleted ranks of the Union Army. When the question of giving the Negroes a chance to fight for their own freedom was at last determined upon by the federal government, a great howl of rage and indignation went up from the South, which, being echoed by their Northern allies, the Copperheads, aroused a bitter prejudice against the measure, which, spreading through our own army, created widespread dissatisfaction. The idea of commanding Negro troops was at first severely ridiculed, and the prejudice was so great that but few men could be found who possessed the moral courage to face the obloquy which threatened to overwhelm all who accepted positions in colored regiments. There were, however, a few commissioned and non-commissioned officers in some of the white regiments whose patriotism and courage could stand the test. These men, stepping into the breach, formed the nucleus of what ultimately became an army of nearly 200,000 well organized, finely drilled, and highly disciplined troops. These troops, as fast as organized and equipped, took the field and, by their conduct under fire, soon won the respect of the whole army. The prejudice against them disappeared, at last, at least in the army, and thereafter white and colored soldiers fought side by side, mingling their blood in a common pool on many hard-fought fields. Maine, of course, doesn't mention the fact that towards the end of the war, the very end of the war, some black men did become officers, about 120 altogether, chaplains and surgeons mostly, but some were made into line officers. Also, there's a certain bias coming from Maine, an experienced white officer who had worked with the 4th Illinois Cavalry before joining the U.S. colored troops. He understood soldiering, and also he had a little bit of his own prejudice coming in and realizing that many of these black men were untrained and needed to be educated in the military, much like he was. There's no evidence in his past before the war that he had any military experience, but it's clear by his remarks that he came to respect the men that he commanded. He came to respect the peers with whom he served. And he, of course, took great pride in the role of all of those white men, including himself, who stood up in a precarious moment. And that's why I particularly like this narrative, because Major Maine defines this very narrow time period. It's really just for a period of months in 1863 when there are the formation of these troops and a lot of questions about even whether they should serve within much of the white population. You students of the Civil War know Robert Gould Shaw. He's the best known white officer of the U.S. colored troops. But I don't think anyone has quite summed up the role of those officers, as well as Major Maine in his address to his comrades at the reunion of the 3rd U.S. Colored Cavalry. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail.